Hey everybody, welcome to XZ Chat. I'm Serge.
I'm Rob.
I'm Gen Z.
I'm Gen X.
And today we are doing a Sabaton History reaction. So we just finished recording our reaction to their song, The Price of a Mile, which was, of course, about the amount of lives that were lost. Over 6 miles of land, 500,000 lives lost at the Battle of Passchendaele. It was a great song. I loved how they were like kind of put into perspective by having like the beat march throughout the entire song and saying thousands of feet march to the beat, which was a cool line. And there were some really powerful words.
Men
said.
Crawl as the generals.
And the men called as the general called. I think that's how it went, right? Yeah. That was also a really powerful one. 6 miles have been won. 500,000 men are gone.
Yeah.
So
powerful song.
Powerful song. And what we did was we actually looked up the battle just to see some images. We wanted to see some images. We found a short little video that showed some like shots. It was in poor quality, of course, because it was over 100 years ago. But it was just interesting to see some footage of what it was like. Maybe I'll as we're like talking, I'll put up a couple of images on the screen for you guys to see some of the images that we saw. Just showcasing what it looked like. It's pretty crazy to look at because these images are from like I said, over 100 years ago, that are capturing a few moments in that battlefield. Yeah. So, Rob, how are you feeling?
I'm eager to hear these guys. I forgot the historian's name. I remember he's from Texas, but it looks like he's interviewing the lead singer.
Yeah.
So I'm really eager to hear this. Incredible history and the story behind it. Now I want to hear more of the details.
Yeah, well, I want to hear more because the song itself we didn't know much about the conflict itself, the Battle of Passchendaele. So it's gonna be interesting to kind of learn more about that conflict. And of course, this took place during World War I. So ready to dive in?
It was in the summer of from I think June 30th through November 10th, 19. Was it the first year, 14 or 15?
Yeah, it was July through November, right?
Yeah. Summer months going into the winter. So, But anyway, let's find out more about it.
Yeah, let's let the experts break it down for us, shall we?
Let's do it.
All right, let's do it.
Joachim, what is the price of a mile?
I'll tell you in a while.
French subtitles.
Oh, French subtitles.
The Ypres salient in 1917 was a dismal place. Since the first battle for the city in late 1914, the whole area had been caught in the stalemate of trench warfare. Whole local villages in no man's land simply ceased to exist. The Germans held the high ground in a half circle around the British positions in front of Ypres, their artillery observers ever watchful. Much of the plains in this region of Belgium, Flanders, was reclaimed bog and marshland that usually lay below sea level and could only be cultivated with the help of a network of drainage ditches. After 3 years of war, though, that system was destroyed, and the whole area turned again into a swamp once the autumn rains began.
And that's something that we saw in the images when we were looking at the footage and the images. When you look at No Man's Land, you have those craters from the explosions. They were like completely filled with mud.
Pools of mud and water.
Yeah, and there's this one image that in particular that when we were looking through some of the images of the battlefield, there's one that particularly struck me, which was it showed like a bunker or some sort of like dugout, and it was like completely flooded.
Right.
And there you saw you could see the soldiers standing outside of it, just kind of standing around, just looking at it. Because like, what do you do in that scenario? You can't exactly get rid of it.
Out.
And that it makes a lot of sense now that the reason there was so much water was because it was basically like bogland, like a swamp. So.
In the gravelly soil, the Germans could not dig their typical deep trench systems, as the heavy clay would quickly become a quagmire when it rained. Instead, they dotted the landscape with strong points, reinforced pillboxes, and ferro-concrete bunkers, and just sat tight. The Allies, in general, were in pretty serious peril in the summer of 1917. The French were wavering after mutiny, and the Russians hard-pressed after a revolution and the danger of another one. And it was up to British Commander Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig to take the pressure off of both. After a stunning victory at Messines Ridge on the right shoulder of Ypres, Haig had thought it possible to push the Germans off Passchendaele Ridge and get an excellent starting point for a decisive offensive. On July 16th, the British bombardment began. From more than 3,000 heavy guns, a hailstorm of fire rained down on the German lines all over the salient. The artillerymen systematically targeted every grid on their map, leaving only death and destruction in their wake. The German soldiers in the shallow forward trenches were obliterated, and only those lucky enough to take shelter in the bunkers escaped the shrapnel-filled air. Whole woods around the salient were blasted down, and only what I guess you'd call a moonscape of shell holes and tree stumps reaching out of the ground like skeletal fingers remained.
Yeah, and one of the images we saw actually was a trench that was completely caved in. I'm guessing that was maybe as a result of the shelling that they did. It was just mass coordinated artillery bombardment to try and just get rid of as many German forces as possible to make it easier to try and push through and get another surprising victory. I think it was the general had already achieved once, the French general, right?
Right.
So
Then, after 2 weeks of bombardment, on July 31st, the advance began. But instead of a frenzied rush over the parapets, the attack slowed to a crawl. It was like trying to cross a freshly plowed field. The soldiers' boots got stuck in the dirt, slipping and stumbling through the bombed-out ground. It was slow and it was exhausting, as they carried 80 pounds of equipment each with things like entrenching tools, grenades, and ammunition. Still, the first attack made rather promising headway towards Plickham Ridge and West Hook, capturing the first German lines. The men cleared the trenches and dugouts while capturing many miserable and shell-shocked German soldiers. British command judged from the first reports that a breakthrough might be imminent and that the capture of Passchendaele Ridge itself was to be within grasp. However, what they had conquered so far was really only a few forward positions and machine gun outposts. The Germans had abandoned the traditional system of trench lines and instead focused on a convoluted defense-in-depth system that went on for miles. So, as the British soldiers ventured on, they suddenly found themselves under well-directed fire from camouflage strongpoints, hidden pillboxes, and snipers. They had, in fact, just entered the kill zone. The first waves were mown down or found themselves soon isolated from the rest of their units. When the early days of August passed, the weather suddenly began to change. The sky darkened with clouds and a thick mist descended over the area. It began to rain, and not just a little, but a torrential downpour, and it did not stop for days. The steady downpour soaked the whole area. Every man and every gun was soon drenched, and the ground softened to an ugly quagmire of mud and clay. The swamp returned early this year. On the battlefield, all sense of direction was immediately lost. The terrain had changed so much that old maps, even recent maps, were useless. Between the skeletal woods and the gas-soaked shell holes, there was nothing on which to orientate yourself.
Wow, that's a really interesting thing that I have never even considered of what it must be like.
Geography changing.
Yeah,
the look
like
of it.
you can't recognize which way to go. One place that looked familiar to you a week ago is just completely different. Not only because of the bombardment and all the destruction that was going on, and the place being reformed by the explosions, right? But also just because, like he said, like it turned into a quagmire because all of a sudden the rain came. And that's of course how we saw those images with like people slogging through the mud and it going up to their knees or waist.
Knee deep, right?
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, and I recall in the song there's a lyric in there, a line where he mentions something about crawling or walking knee deep in mud. And literally we're seeing that in these films.
Yeah, and also there was I think he also mentioned in the song where soldiers die in mud. So that they're also dying in the mud, of course, getting shot, getting trapped, and of course, a myriad of different things.
Yeah, something really horrific. My understanding is that there were, I don't know the number, but there were many men who drowned in the mud. They were injured or something had fallen on them, but they were in the trenches, and so they literally drowned. Actually, that was their cause of death because they couldn't get up or people didn't see them, because they were under a thick pool of water and mud.
Yeah, I could imagine, especially if you're wounded, and you just fall into the muddy water and you can't exactly pull yourself out. Then you're dying that way.
Yeah,
Ready to continue?
It was an extraordinary panorama, half frightening, half exciting. Everywhere, as far as you could see, there were spurts of earth from shells bursting, and bursts of shrapnel and high explosives, and men looking like ants in the distance. You couldn't speak. The gunfire was so terrific. But you don't really hear the explosions individually. You just see them going off like geysers shooting up in the air. As far as you could see in front of you and to either side, there was nothing but mud, mud, mud for miles, and just a few stumps of trees here and there, and all hell let loose all around you. The stretcher bearers had it especially hard, down to their waists in the morass and the mud. Each step was exhausting. It took 4 to 6 men to carry one stretcher, and even small distances could take hours to cover. And at night, it was simply impossible to evacuate the wounded because of the danger of getting lost or stuck in the mud.
Wow.
Many wounded died waiting for the morning to come. The Germans shared their misery, and it is reported that there was an unspoken rule to not fire on the stretcher parties.
That's what I was wondering. Did they have ceasefire periods to allow people to take the wounded back or and to bury the bodies? But it sounds like they just in general at any point in the day there's like one of those honor rules that was covered in the Christmas truce, where there's this idea you don't blow up our toilet dugouts,
Are those going to fill their canteens with water?
Like you don't do this to us, we don't do it to you. And so it looks like that same rule applied here in the case of don't shoot at those who are evacuating the wounded, which is of course
the medics.
a great thing, right? So ready?
Yeah.
Lying wounded in the swamp was a terrible fate. Then there was a lull in the shelling, and through the machine gun slit on the back wall of the pillbox, we heard this terrible kind of gurgling noise. It was the wounded, lying there sinking, and this liquid mud burying them alive, running over their faces, into their mouth and nose. We had to keep heaving the duck boards up and trying to put some other stuff underneath, just so that the fellows wouldn't sink so much. We could not understand why, in the name of God, anyone had ordered an attack like that over terrain like that. It was impossible. The heavier guns sank deeper into the ground each time they fired, and the men had to abandon the safety of their trenches as they filled up to their armpits with water. Engineers tried to bridge the flooded shell holes with pontoons, wooden walkways. However, those duckboards soon became haunting image of the Passchendaele campaign. There was this constant fear of falling off and drowning in the morass, which was the fate of any soldier carrying his load who did so. The dead often simply disappeared in the mud, never to be seen again. 42,000 such bodies were never recovered at all. In a way...
Wow, I wonder if there's any sort of like improvised training or instruction given by like the field officers on the who are like on the scene, basically telling soldiers to like in an emergency situation, if you were to accidentally stumble off into the water, quickly like disengage all your gear to try and get out.
Interesting thought.
I'm just curious, like how they adapt to these scenarios, where they basically instruct other men like, hey, even no matter how important your gear is, just dump it all the second you go into the water, because otherwise you're gonna die.
Yeah, you can sink. 42,000 MIAs, bodies were never recovered at Passchendaele alone.
Right.
That's mind-boggling.
Yeah, out of 500,000. So that's nearly 10% of the bodies were not able to be recovered. I think he said it as a result of this, right? As a result of and it's interesting because you were just talking about how soldiers were drowning in that way, and then he goes into detail about how some soldiers heard gurgling, and it wasn't just something that happened; it was something that happened often.
Yeah.
So
this number is mind-boggling here from this one battle, this one area. 40,000. In the American Vietnam War, there were 52,000 deaths on the American side. And that was over a period of, some would argue 25 years, others might argue lesser, like 17 years. But whatever it is, 52,000 deaths from that war on the American side. And here we see in one particular battle within a 3.5 month period, 42,000 bodies were just missing from the problem of the mud and the change of the topography because of the rain. That's mind-blowing.
Yeah, and it's interesting that that even attacks were ordered in those conditions. Like there wasn't like any sort of alleviation.
Yeah, that's what somebody mentioned, right?
Yeah, that's what he mentions, that one of the soldiers, I think one of the first person accounts was like, they can't believe that they were actually ordered, anyone ordered an attack in those conditions.
Right.
So, ready to carry on?
Let's play it.
Hey, it was worse when the mud didn't stick you down. When it yielded under your feet, you knew that it was a body you were treading on. It was terrifying. You'd tread on the stomach, perhaps, and it would grunt all of the air out of its body. It made your hair stand on end. The smell could make you vomit.
Yeah.
And you could always tell whether it was a dead Jerry or a dead Tommy. The Germans smelt different in death.
Oh, that's interesting. Probably a different diet and lifestyle. Right. Grew up in different regions.
It rained nearly all August long, one of the wettest months in local history. Without the ability to bring the heavy guns forward, the battles usually came down to small group actions. British battle groups and German counterattacks clashed with light machine guns and hand grenades in chaotic and confusing skirmishes.
And just out of curiosity, I want to take a look at that machine. It looked like a Lewis machine gun, but I want to confirm.
Small group actions. British battle groups and German counterattacks clashed.
Yeah, I think that's a Lewis machine gun. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but they had that round magazine on the top. You can see right here, this magazine. So it's like the circular and like kind of rotate as you would fire.
Oh, right. I've seen that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's basically like more of a lightweight machine gun, because you have the heavy machine guns which would take multiple men to carry, and it would be like stationed. Then you have like a gun, an ammunition belt that would feed into it. These are kind of more lightweight because you can
and
have
one
them around
man could
easier.
carry it. As
Right.
an infantry.
Yeah.
Soldier.
Yeah, I believe so. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's what it is.
And you said a Lewis
machine gun. So I think it's a British model, which makes sense because these are British soldiers right here. So ready to carry on?
Yeah.
Let's see.
With light machine guns and hand grenades in chaotic and
Those are also
confusing
referred to as stick
skirmishes
grenades.
without much cohesion or tactical finesse. As August came to a close, tens of thousands of men had already lost their lives. Some places had changed hands a dozen times, and whole map points were eradicated. The British forces were exhausted, and it passed to the Australians, South Africans, and New Zealanders to slowly grind away at the German defenses, which were in turn manned by exhausted, tired, and dirty men for weeks on end. Everybody was miserable and filled with frustration. When elite units from the Anzacs met with the Prussian Guards, there were no prisoners taken. So far, more than 100,000 Allied casualties had paid for the advance of 3.5 miles. But they could not remain in the swamp. By winter, they had to push the Germans off the main ridge or pull back to their starting positions.
Yeah, and this is a pretty interesting scene right here with the tank. Look at the way its tread is like bent up. And I believe this was one of the earliest tank models that was introduced into the war. Of course, World War I was like one of the first major conflicts you see tanks brought into the war. Yeah. And this one, I believe, is a British model. I think it was like a Mark something. I don't remember the exact name. I'll probably put it like up here in the video. But it's a pretty famous tank design. So let me rewind a little bit and we can continue.
3.5 miles. But they could not remain in the swamp. By winter, they had to push the Germans off the main ridge or pull back to their starting positions. But this could only be achieved by throwing more lives against the German defenses. The fighting for Zonnebeke and the Menin Road had eventually turned the salient around. And by the end of September, it was the Germans who were getting surrounded. The new tactic by General Herbert Plumer to bite into the German defenses and hold limited objectives proved successful against German counterattacks. And with the weather clearing up, the heavy artillery could finally be brought up in support. But the German center was still strongly held. The British had no choice but to prepare for the final push, no matter the cost. By mid-October, and tens of thousands of more casualties later, there was only a small way to go to Passchendaele itself. Haig intended to bring in the Canadian and French forces for the final push. But the commanding Canadian general, Arthur Currie, took one hard look at the battlefield and said that his men would not attack until everything was prepared as favorably as possible. Haig had little choice but to agree, and they began preparing the battlefield and stocking up on artillery shells. What followed was another month of murderous bombardment and fierce fighting in a nightmarish environment. It was a long, hard slog up Passchendaele Ridge, and the casualties were enormous. Still, with the Canadians at the fore, the Allies gradually pushed onwards, duking it out against the stubborn German defenders, both sides trading lives for ground. In the end, the Germans had no working answer for the British bite-and-hold tactics, and were gradually pushed off their defenses. The village of Passchendaele itself was unrecognizable. It was simply bombed out of existence. The battle officially ended on November 10th, as the final important high ground was captured, although smaller fighting would still go on the rest of the year. The ultimate number of casualties that had vanished in the mud during the battle for Passchendaele Ridge is still unknown. It is realistic to say that at least 500,000 men from both sides had paid for the ground of 6 miles.
Wow.
So the price of each mile is over 80,000 men.
Yep.
80,000. The name...
That was the quick math you did as well. That you said it was around 83,000
During the song, yeah.
Right. And it's pretty crazy out to see like all the buildings that are completely devastated. You can see like there's like wood splinters everywhere, or it's like just like brick walls just barely standing still. I wonder like what was the process for like all the people who used to live there? Like what was the process for them evacuating? Like how much time was given for them to leave? What kind of message did they receive about leaving? Where were they relocated to? And it's just all these interesting questions. Like what from a civilian standpoint, what does that look like, right?
Yeah.
And then to come back after the war is over, what do you do then, right?
Yeah, certainly clean up and rebuild, but the emotional toil it took and the trauma, to come back and rebuild.
Yeah.
Pick up your life afterwards.
Yeah, and I feel like in many cases they wouldn't come back, right? Because there's nothing left there, really.
Right.
So, and it's pretty crazy because he even mentioned that as people would be walking across the battlefield, they'd just be walking on bodies, and they could tell if it was their own or someone else just by the smell. So, pretty gnarly.
Yeah. Let's continue.
Over 80,000 men. 80,000. The name Passchendaele will forever speak of a terrible battle, of incredible hardship and incredible suffering. And that is something on which everyone can agree.
Young men are dying. They pay the price. Oh, how they suffer. So tell me what's the price of a mile?
Now, at the beginning, Joachim, you said you're going to tell them what the price of a mile is, and I'm sure they thought that was somehow a joke or something, but it's not.
When we did the research, me and Pat were writing the lyrics. Oh, this is back in late 2007, I think, when we wrote the lyrics for this one. And actually, we were starting to think of that ourselves. What's the price of a mile? Obviously, we're talking about paying the price in young men's lives, as the lyrics say.
Right.
And then we wanted to find out, well, how many are we talking then? And what's the price for a mile? We then figured out, as far as we could tell, again, we could be wrong, that we're talking about 6 miles.
Oh, the maximum advance.
Yeah.
The maximum, okay.
Okay,
Sure. Yeah.
450,000 in 6 miles. I'm bad at math, but that should be about 75,000 miles.
Exactly 75,000. 75,000 lives per mile.
So I guess that's the price of a mile.
Now, was this your first World War I themed song? Or
No, actually. The first one was Angels Calling on Apero Dominatus in 2006. This one came out on Art of War in 2008. But I think actually when we did this song, I remember it clearly. I think we were sitting in Per's dad's office, after hours.
Yeah.
We borrowed that to get some peace and quiet to write lyrics. And that's when we first time opened the idea that, man, we should make a whole, concept album about World War I one day.
Yeah. And it took a lot of years.
Oh, yeah. This is late 2007.
Quick question. He said a whole album?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so I know what I'm going to enjoy listening to in time after our reactions.
Yeah.
Wow.
when this happened. But yeah, in a way, this song and the research we did was the inspiration to the Great War album.
Of all the battles of the First World War, you picked one that's not one of the more well-known, not the Somme or Verdun. Well, how did you happen to end up with Passchendaele?
We looked around the Western Front
Yeah.
because obviously this is the Art of War album,
Right.
and we wanted every track to correspond to a chapter, 13 chapters
Oh, yeah,
in
sure,
Sun
yeah.
Tzu's
Yeah.
book or scroll, no matter what you want to call it. And at that point, on that chapter, Sun Tzu talks of the importance of a dynamic conflict and avoiding stalemates. And we thought Passchendaele would be one of the most iconic or perfect examples
Yeah.
for a useless standstill.
Sun Tzu would not have been happy.
No.
They would have said, you guys, did you not learn? It's been like 2,500 years. You
Yes,
guys didn't learn. Did you read the book,
Did you
Doug?
read the book,
Did you
right?
read the book,
The Art
Doug?
of War, right?
And then, and it's funny they're talking about it because that is something they included in the lyric video. Was they included a quote by Sun Tzu.
Yeah.
It's interesting that he asked that question about like why did you choose Passchendaele, not the Somme Verdun, right? Because that's a battle I did hear about because in school they did teach about like the Battle of Verdun
Highly significant.
and the Battle of the Somme, but I never heard of Passchendaele until now.
Same here.
So it's interesting that they cover not only like the main conflicts, but they also cover some ones that you might not know about, which basically opens the window for learning more.
And I really like, because of that, it's really giving tribute to all these men who lost their lives in that battle.
Right. Yeah.
I wonder if Doug Haig actually read The Art of War.
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. Well, you guys can read The Art of War, and there's a link to the online version of it in the description. We can put that there.
And
'cause
it's
it is-
public domain, so it's free to download for anyone who wants.
Wow.
And it's a pretty short read and quite interesting. I would highly recommend it.
Oh,
But
sure.
also
I thought it would've been
interesting
one.
is to listen to the album The Art of War, song by song, and read the chapter about Sun, and see how it relates to the Sabaton song about that chapter.
Good idea.
So that's your homework for now, but we will
There
see
it
you
is.
next week on Sabaton History.
Yes, and there will be a test on the Art of War question.
I was just thinking.
Yeah, I find it funny because that's one of the things we said when we first reacted to a soundbite. Then was like school would have been so much more interesting if they
my
taught
gosh.
it in this way.
Yeah.
It's funny that they are kind of making a joke out of it, out of that whole like little scenario by saying like that's your homework. The test will be next so and so. So
We walked away remembering a lot more, right?
right.
Yes.
Okay,
I just told them to.
Yeah, I know, but I have to talk to Per because Per's hosting next week's episode, so I have to tell him he's got to check the. Oh yeah. There's going to be a
There's going to be a test on
There's
that.
a test.
Per will be cool with that, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll find out in the future on Sabaton History.
Long way from home, paying the price in young men's lives.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you so much for the support with the community. All the Patreons, everyone who's helping, sharing this. We really love doing this, and thanks to you, we can keep on doing it. So keep on doing what you do, and we will keep on doing what we do. Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah, I want to learn more about the group, even the name, and how they came up with the name. There's probably a meaning behind it, and I don't yet know what that is. But I want to find
Yeah,
out.
that's a good point. Yeah, it kind of sounds like a metal Sabaton.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well,
Almost like a,
it has like a metal
tiny
sound to
sword
it,
or
a rocky
something.
metal sound to it as well.
Yeah.
like the music style, right? So,
yeah.
but I enjoyed that. It was definitely interesting to hear more and learn more about the battle. It really puts it into perspective, talking about what it was like to they're stepping over bodies and completely covered in mud, and it was just like this terrible scenario, and you had to walk for hours just to like. Between 4 and 6 men would have to walk for hours to carry a
a
body.
wounded man on the gurney.
Yeah, and it'd be a lot of work, and I'm guessing like in many cases they wouldn't rations could dwindle in some cases because all the different groups are like separated. Like the way he was mentioning it wasn't like a traditional trench system because it was so hard to dig those trenches because they're just flooding.
Yeah.
So they just had these small pockets, and I'm assuming these small pockets that are like exhausted. They're and isolated. In many cases, they might not be able to receive rations on a regular basis, as is intended.
Right.
Is what is intended is to receive regular rations. That's not always possible. You might just have men stranded out so far deep into the territory that you might not have anyone going out there that frequently.
Yeah, it sounds like the weather changed what would be considered an ad hoc transportation system And you never knew, to your point, it's a great point, what you're going to get in terms of artillery, rations, medical needs, all of that. And so also with the change of the topography, changing transportation systems, I'll call them, it changes also communication and the whole deal of how to get the word back to the general and the planners for people on how to execute further this whole chaotic scene here in this battle.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed learning more about the history part of it, because for me in school we learned a lot more about World War II than World War One. So it's interesting to hear more about World War One as well, because in World War One there's only a few conflicts that were covered, like the Battle of Verdun, the Battle of the Somme, as well as some others. So.
Yeah, excellent video here. A great song that we listened to, which led us into watching this history of the song or of the battle. And well done. And I need to commit to memory the name of their historian, because I find him he's just very interesting, well spoken. I like what he has to share and how he shares it.
And he does a great job of condensing, speaking clearly, and just really just bringing home all the main points to make you remember what he's saying.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Great job.
With that being said, we hope you guys enjoyed. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell icon to let us know you want to see more. And stay tuned for the next one.
We will see you soon.
All right, guys. Take care.